Okay, we're going to continue this discussion of disorders of sensory with disorders of the ear. And to start with, we're going to review a little bit of how the ear works. So the external ear, the pinna, and the external auditory meatus, so the ear canal. The middle ear is from the eardrum, the three bones, and the space that the bones are in, and the auditory tube, which we used to call the eustachian tube, that connects to inside the nasal cavity, right, the nasopharynx. Then the inner ear is the cochlea, which is the organ of Corti, which is the sensor for hearing, and the semicircular canals, which is for balance and equilibrium. So if we look at the picture, the outer ear is here, the middle ear is here, with the malleus, incus, and stapes. The inner ear is the cochlea, with the organ of Corti, and the semicircular canals. I'm not going to worry about the oval window and etc. The auditory nerve is cranial nerve 8. Here. So the eustachian tube, its job is to make sure that the air pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane is equalized. This is open to the nasopharynx, and usually at atmospheric pressure, and the external auditory canal. The meatus is the same pressure, atmospheric pressure. So, when sound waves enter the external ear, it's collected by the pinna and then concentrated into the meatus. The moving air causes vibration of the eardrum, the tympanic membrane, and that causes the three bones to move. The one is attached to the eardrum itself. The next one is attached to the other two bones, and there's leverage involved here. It's a second-class lever, so it's a speed lever. So a little bit of movement at one end causes a lot of movement at the other. So it really is a mechanical amplifier of the vibrations of the tympanic membrane. That little vibration moves the one bone a little bit, which causes more movement because of leverage in the next bone, which causes a lot more movement in the third bone, the stapes. The stapes pushes against the oval window of the cochlea. There's fluid in the cochlea, and that movement at the window creates a wave in the fluid, and the wave moves the little hair cells in the organ of Corti. The movement of these hair cells, the stimulation of his hair cells with this movement, causes a transduction, and that causes the nerves to fire, the vestibulocochlear nerve. And those neurons firing is how we interpret hearing. Now, you took it all in physiology, but the narrowing of the place where the fluid is will resonate at different frequencies of the wave and will stimulate those hair cells more. And so that's how we hear different frequencies. The semicircular canals are all at right angles to each other, and they're for balance, right? So the endolymph moves within the semicircular canal to correspond with the movement of the head. And then the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve conducts that to the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. And again, it's for balance. Okay, so we're going to start the pathology with simple hearing loss. Now, there's two types of hearing loss. One is a conduction loss. So either the sound doesn't pass down the auditory meatus, the external ear canal, because that's blocked. It can be a foreign object, like it could be an insect, it could be an accumulation of wax, it could be scar tissue, people picking at the earwax and damaging. And so that can just be a conduction deafness right there. Usually if it's wax, it can be cleared. Another common thing is something called otosclerosis of the three bones of the ossicles. So what this is almost like an arthritic condition where the bones join each other. And sclerosis means thickening, and otto means ear. So otosclerosis is a thickening of the inner or the middle ear bones. And they just don't vibrate as much, and they don't amplify the sound mechanically when that happens. And so that's considered a conduction deafness. Another place where this can happen is where the stay piece contacts the oval window. There's a little bony opening there, and that can narrow. It can become sclerotic, and the stapes doesn't move as freely. So all of those are conduction. The other type of hearing loss is got something to do with the sensors in the cochlea or the auditory nerve. So damage to the organ of Corti itself or to nerve damage. So that could be from infections. If an infection gets into the endolymph, there's not very good immune responses in there, and it can damage those hair cells. It could be also physical damage. Prolonged exposure to a loud noise will do it. It's interesting, my father, in his early career, before he went into management, was an engineer on the railroad. And in those days especially, there wasn't any sound insulation in the engines, and he was early diesel engines. And there are 8 positions on the throttle, and wide open and as loud as it's going to get is called position 8. And there's a specific frequency that those engines run at. And my dad had hearing loss at that exact frequency. He could hear other frequencies just fine, but he had a gap at that frequency that was throttle 8 on the engines. And what's interesting is that frequency of sound happened to be the exact same frequency, the same register as the turn signal on his car. And he had a car that didn't automatically, there was something wrong, it didn't necessarily, the turn signal didn't necessarily go off after the turn automatically. And he used to drive for kilometers with his turn signal on because he never heard it. It was something we teased him about for years. That's prolonged exposure to loud sounds. Sudden, very loud sounds will do it as well. What they started to find is that artillerymen would go deaf. My brother was a rock star. He was in Honeymoon Suite, and he wore earplugs the whole while he was on stage because the loud sounds. Too many people that he knew had hearing loss. Head trauma, neurological disorders, ototoxic drugs, including nicotine, will do it. or just getting older, presbycusis. Some people also have congenital defects, so like the stapes is malformed or something like that. So all of those things are sensorineural impairment as opposed to conduction. We screen newborns for hearing deficits. People with hearing loss tend to wear hearing aids. They're very common, especially as people get older. If it's sensorineural, sometimes cochlear implants are used. And this is literally a wire that goes into the cochlea and causes the neurons to fire, to have their action potentials, because of an electric charge being provided by the device. So there's a receiver, a transmitter, and an implant right into an electrode into the cochlea that causes the nerves to fire. This is a little bit of semantics, but if someone is deaf, it really means there's a congenital hearing deficit. If they're deafened, it's an acquired hearing deficit. Now, like I say, this is semantics. People with acquired hearing deficit will probably refer to themselves as deaf. I don't know. There's probably some political correctness creeping into this as well. But nevertheless, that's the correct terminology. Hearing impaired is the term. When I was in school, hard of hearing was the preferred term. Again, these things follow a certain amount of fashion, I guess. Okay, infection is obviously a problem. And middle ear infections are probably more common and more troublesome. It's called otitis media, which means middle ear. Itis refers to inflammation, so this is inflammation of the middle ear. Could be infection, could be other things. Usually it's infection. And what happens is, because of the inflammation and the infection, an exudate builds up and fills the cavity that surrounds the ossicles. And it will push out on the tympanic membrane and make it harder to move the tympanic membrane. It may close off the eustachian tube, the auditory tube, because the lumen of that tube is quite small, and the inflammation of the mucosa of it can close up that lumen significantly fairly quickly, especially in kids, because the lumen is much smaller in kids, but the thickness of the mucosa is the same in kids and adults. So the ratio is far different. Big problem is if this pressure builds up and the person ends up in lower pressure situations, like in an airplane or in if the pressure on the inside of the tympanic membrane becomes much greater than the outside, this is a delicate little piece of tissue and it could rupture. A big problem with if the inflammation and infection is prolonged, that you can end up with scar tissue and adhesions, especially of the ossicles, so they won't move as freely and produce like a conductive hearing loss. Oftentimes when this happens in kids during speech development, it also leads to speech problems. They don't hear themselves and they don't hear other people as well, and so their speech becomes characteristic. The infections can move right into the air spaces of the mastoid bone, or the mastoid process of the temporal bone, really. And that would be called mastoiditis. Not to be confused with mastitis, which is infection of the breast. The mastoid process of the temporal bone looks like a breast, and that's why it's mastoid. Looks like breast. Itis is inflammation. So how do we get these ear infections? They're actually fairly easy to get, and that's because a respiratory infection can pass up the auditory tube, the eustachian tube, and get into the middle ear that way. Oftentimes, if you blow your nose and you block your nose to build up the pressure to blow, it will back up, and the pressure can go into the middle ear, and it will push infected cells and things up in there. Haemophilus influenza is a common thing, especially in kids. So is strep and staph. So it's beta hemolytic streptococci, same thing that gives you the strep throat. Pneumococci will do it. Viral infections will do it, especially like the common cold, the viral infections of the cold, or even the flu. And then that inflammation from the viral infections and the natural killer cells and cytotoxic T lymphocytes killing the mucosal cells leave a portal of entry for secondary bacterial infections. So viral infections can get complicated fairly quickly and fairly easily. And most of it really revolves around having an infection of the nasal cavity, which is common, and blowing the nose and backing this material back up into the sinuses and into the auditory tube that gets into the middle ear, causes otitis media. And it's more common in children, again, because of the lumen size of that eustachian tube. And so that material will get moved up into there, and then the eustachian tube the inflammation will close it off, and there's no escaping it. Could be asymptomatic, but usually it's really severe earache pain. The tympanic membrane gets really inflamed, it's red, it bulges, because the tympanic membrane actually has blood supply. There's a feeling of fullness, maybe some mild hearing loss. It's a lot like when your ears have to pop when you're on an airplane, but it doesn't go away. If it's a bad enough infection, you could get systemic symptoms like nausea, fever, that kind of thing. So we use ibuprofen or acetaminophen for pain and for a certain amount of anti-inflammatory properties, break a fever. You use antibacterials, so antibiotics, if you can determine it's a bacterial infection. Generally speaking, we don't swab and culture that and wait. Generally, antibiotics are given almost routinely for this kind of thing. Decongestants are important because you can drain through the auditory tube if you can get the mucus away, and you get the inflammation down in that. Putting tubes in the ears, a little tube through the tympanic membrane to allow drainage out the external auditory meatus, as opposed to the eustachian tube, can be quite useful, and it happens in a lot of kids. So this is what a normal tympanic membrane looks when you use the otoscope. You can see the light reflecting on it, so it's kind of got a dish surface. You can see the incus bone right there. You can see a bit of the malleus as well, touching up against the membrane. If it's inflamed, it looks like this. So when you first look through an otoscope and you see it, there's no mistaking that there is inflammation. External infections, otitis externa, swimmer's ears, it's usually bacterial, but it could be fungal, kind of depending on where. A lot of times it's bacterial from swimming in dirty water. That's why we call it swimmer's ears. So it's usually the external auditory canal, but it could be the pinna. In the past, when I was a kid, it was almost entirely from having dirty water in the ear and getting caught in there. So it's sometimes irritation from cleaning your ears, especially using Q-tips. You can impact and irritate the surface and maybe scratch the surface and get an infection that way. But more recently now, with so many people using earbuds, it's much more common. Basically, you're closing off the external auditory meatus with an earbud, and you're trapping things in there. And you keep your earbuds in your pocket, which may not be the cleanest, or your purse, which is probably the dirtiest place outside of the toilet, because it is. And then you stick that in your ear, a warm, dark, moist spot. When we want to culture bacteria and grow, we put them in a petri dish, which has proteins and lipids in the agar, and we put them in the dark in a moist spot and warm. Well, earwax and the secretions of the ear are proteins and lipids, and it's a dark, moist spot that's warm. You can culture bacteria quite easily there if you don't let the air exchange. Oftentimes, if you pull on your earlobe, it moves the ear canal and it hurts like hell. Some people have a purulent discharge, like literally pus running out of their ears, and oftentimes there's a hearing deficit. Usually it's a conductive deficit, just from the inflammation. Chronic disorders, probably the most important one is otosclerosis, which is an imbalance in bone deposition and bone reabsorption, and so you end up with the stapes especially becoming too large for the space in the oval window, the osseous space in the oval window, and it basically gets stuck and it blocks the conduction of sound to the cochlea. Could be genetic or environmental factors that are doing it. It's probably both. Probably genetic predisposition triggered by environmental factors. Could be that you had the genetic predisposition, and then you get an otitis media, which then sets the whole thing off. Probably fairly common. Both my nieces actually have a certain amount of this. They've got some hearing loss because of otosclerosis, and both of them was because of otitis media, and they're twins, so one does have to imagine there's a genetic component to this. They had tubes put in their ears to drain this recurrent otitis media, but now, as 28-year-old women, they both have a certain amount of conductive hearing loss because of otosclerosis. They haven't got to the point where the stapes gets removed and replaced with a prosthetic piece of plastic. So they just use hearing aids for it. Meniere's is an important one. We see this a lot. People get vertigo and nausea. So these are labyrinthal disorders. So this is the semicircular canals primarily, but it's intermittent. There's remissions and exacerbations. Stress will bring it on. Lack of sleep brings it on. And really, the endolymph that's in this in the cochlea is like any of the other fluids in the body that we keep on talking about. It's more than just a fluid for being there. It also carries nutrients and oxygen and then takes away waste products. So it's constantly being created in one area and reabsorbed back into the bloodstream in a different area. So it's constantly being changed over. And as soon as you get an imbalance in these things, just like the glaucoma, if the endolymph is being produced faster than it is being reabsorbed, then you end up with this pressure. And the pressure causes malfunction of those hair cells, and it will manifest as balance disorders and vertigo. And oftentimes it's in one ear only. So your left ear is telling your head that one bit of information, your right ear is telling your brain a different bit of information, and your brain doesn't know how to resolve it, so it tries to resolve both, and you feel like you're spinning. You feel vertigo from that. Oftentimes what happens is this builds up and builds up and builds up, and a change in barometric pressure can precipitate the attack. So a weather front coming through, going up in an airplane, those kinds of barometric pressure changes will precipitate an attack of this. So there's all kinds of tests they do, MRIs, simple balance tests where you close your eyes and put your arms out, and nystagmus, and so you measure the amount of eye movement, of nystagmus eye movement, because what happens here is your brain will try and resolve the differences from the organs of balance by trying to do it with the eyes. And so this is kind of the reverse of motion sickness. In motion sickness, you're riding in a car or something, your inner ear is saying there's no motion, but your eyes are tracking lots of motion through the window. So the information from your eyes doesn't match the information from your ears, and you end up nauseated from this. This is the information from your ears is saying there's motion, and your eyes is saying there's not. So your eyes react by trying to look for the motion, and that causes this nystagmus. And it worsens with motion because now you're adding another layer of complexity to this. So home exercise programs and various drugs to reduce the sensitivity to the motion. Oftentimes when people get this, they just want to lie down in a dark room and have their eyes closed. Because there's less information getting to the brain. There's no movement of the head, and there's nothing in the visual field. So that's all we're going to cover in ear pathologies. So, yeah.